Welcome, everyone. Today we're going back on Expect the Unexpected, and we're going to discuss AI regulation. Is your AI ethical? The answer might surprise you. I'm joined with Gana Pogrebna today. It's a pleasure to have you here, Gana. Professor Gana is the lead for behavioral science at the Alan Turing Institute and quite an active thought leader in the areas of data science, AI, and ethics. Gana, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Scott. Great to be here. Thanks a lot.
So let's start off by just getting a little bit more background about you. Can you tell us a little bit about your work in ethical AI at the Alan Turing Institute?
Sure. I have to say that I approach ethical AI as a developer. So I'm trained as a decision scientist originally. So I kind of started my career as economist/psychologist, but then my research became more and more data scientist. And along the way, I obviously was really interested in explainable AI, trustworthy AI, ethical AI, and now I work with some really distinguished colleagues who are ethicists and lawyers. For example, Karen Jung is one of my co-authors on several articles in this area. And yeah, we've recently contributed to Oxford Handbook of Ethics of AI, and yeah, have done several, basically several research projects in this area and have active interest in it.
Great, thank you, Gana. So, one of the things that I got really attracted to was one of your comments that you made recently in a sponsored report that FICO did with Cranium. And it was around, the state of responsible AI. And the quote is, I'll read it here, is, at the moment, companies decide for themselves as to what is ethical and unethical, which is extremely dangerous. Self-regulation does not work. And in that same report, I think we found that, between the chief analytics officers and chief AI officers and chief data officers, that only like 22% or so even have an ethics board to help them with those decisions. So with your comment and quote as backdrop and that statistic from the report, I mean, what do you think the current state is of ethical AI across different organizations today?
I think it's a very cool problem, a practical problem for many executives and for many businesses. And I think there are kind of three aspects to it, probably. The first one is, I guess that companies want to deliver responsible technology. I personally haven't met a company that would say, "Oh, we want to do kind of a responsible business." And the reason is it's not just that companies want to be good. I think that they realize that being ethical and being responsible with their technology is their competitive advantage. So if you recall, for example, I don't know, Apple AdWord from last year, it's all about privacy. It's all about responsibility. So companies do realize that whoever has the responsible kind of trademark, they will trade better than the neighbor. So I think it's in their best interest, right? The problem is that, well, there's just too much uncertainty about technology, and even if you are developing technology that you think is benign, a few years down the line could have an unanticipated consequences. So it's all about kind of this unanticipated risk. To give a specific example, if we take Facebook, right? No one could imagine that Facebook would be threatening democracy, with all these recent scandals it's been through recently. And I guess there is a third problem that is really highlighted in your report, and it's around skill sets, right? So it's very difficult to work with this concept of responsible AI, and the skill sets are just not there yet. And the companies are basically scrambling for people with the right interdisciplinary transferable skills that could help them approach this area.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. In some of the conversations I've had with colleagues in the industry, some of them feel that some of their applications aren't, don't need to be ethical, right? They don't have a standard that they're trying to fit to, right? And so they sometimes try to class AI as areas that are high risk or areas that are lower risk or only internal. And I think others struggle sometimes with not having the tools, right? So how do I measure ethics, or how do I measure fairness, or what is fair enough, right? And it's really interesting. I see, as you mentioned, a big striving for wanting to be ethical, but not as much support in some of these organizations for, okay, let's define what that standard looks like. Let's define what fair is, and incrementally get there. And I think that sort of framework is part of the conversation today that we're having, because we look at each of these companies sometimes as a silo, like an island, and they have to figure it out on their own. And sometimes it's a chief analytics officer, sometimes they're not even that role in an organization, and someone else is trying to define what ethics means. And so it brings me to my next question, and one that I think is really interesting, and it has tie-ins to both of our sort of interests and work in cybersecurity, I think, which is, that there is not a consensus, right? If we looked across an industry around how to measure fairness and what is the threshold, or what is ethical and what is those thresholds. So what do you think about organizations coming together as industries to self-regulate or impose standards that they would all be measured on? And I bring that up because of cybersecurity. We see things like the ISACs, and each of these ISACs are different for each of these industries, and they have unique challenges. So what's your thoughts about industries being able to do that, and is that the next step in this evolution of going beyond recognizing a need to be ethical, and putting pen to paper and really writing down how it's going to be achieved?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the core of the problem, this heterogeneity of standards in terms of companies defining ethics as they see fit, but it's not because they don't want to define it, right? It's because it's just they're in the circumstance, the context is such that they have to do it this way. So if we talk about trust or responsibility, well, there are kind of two separate things here. There is ethics and there is law, right? And most companies are just trying to be compliant, right? They try to comply with legal regulations that they have. So clearly, having a regulation would be nice, but on the other hand, well, when we talk about self-regulating, it's also about, well, one problem is complexity that we already mentioned, but the second one is the motivation, right? So if we look at industries that are regulating well, for example, nuclear or airspace, so they are self-regulating because they have a common goal, right? So if there is a huge incident with an airspace or with a nuclear object, right? It's in everybody's best interest to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Well, in data-driven industries, the situation is completely different, because data is money. So data is your competitive advantage. Therefore, information sharing is basically not in your best interest. So the whole sort of rules of the game are such that, it's very difficult to self-regulate and come together and share information. So I guess where we need to work towards is creating the structures and contexts for the companies to be able to share information freely and have an incentive to do so. Then we can actually reach some sort of self-regulation in this area.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and one that I think about often, right? Because we have data, but we also have unique intellectual property, right? And we see more and more, right? Those that are going to be ethical and can demonstrate it, it's a competitive advantage. Those that would be exposed, right, as not being as practiced, let's say, in having that established, right, that has negative implications. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and I follow, is this concept of AI advocacy, right? More and more consumer groups are becoming aware of all the impacts that AI has on their lives, and that may be yet another sort of forcing feature. One of the topics that I like to talk about a lot is the exposure of these topics and the importance of it at the board level, right? And very often even the boards are not really tracking this as one of the things that the chief risk officer of an organization needs to pay attention to. So probably a lot of work, right? One is motivating that this is really core and important to a company, right, in terms of its its DNA and it's how it's understood in the market. And then the backlash, whether it be from regulators or lawsuits or just advocacy around the proper use of AI. So maybe a counterpoint then, right? We know that we have these competitive pressures, and organizations may continue to compete on better IP and not want to expose the inner workings of their AI and machine learning, because that's a lot of their competitive advantage. So one could argue maybe that the self-regulation won't work, right? In cybersecurity, I look at those areas, and it's an attack on an industry, and they all have the same problem. And for example, my work at FICO, a lot of what I do is fraud and financial crime models, right? And so nobody competes on fraud because it's an industry problem. And I think that this ISACs are similar, right? If you can protect yourself from cybersecurity threat, then there's no need to compete on that, right? People share and they get stronger. So the question would be, has the train left the station, right? Will it be that self-regulation and industry organization maybe won't really materialize in the way that we want it to, and it will have to be regulation? So what's your thoughts about that? I we're both keenly aware of the EU regulation and a lot of the regulations across the globe. Some of them in Brazil and other places very, very strong. So what's your thoughts? I mean, is that going to be maybe the more likely outcome? Is we're going to see heavier and stricter enforcement of regulation in the near future to force this topic?
I think that's, some regulation is definitely due, some past due, like you said. And in terms of GDPR regulation in Europe, or there is a similar regulation in California, I think it's, on the one hand, it's a great thing because we learned that we have this new digital rights that we should all be excited about. I think this is great. My research shows that people do not very often exercise these rights. So when we actually ask people, did you request your data from companies under this new GDPR regulation? So under the new regulation, you can actually request your entire digital footprint from any company, and people actually don't make use of that. So I think there is a big kind of literacy problem there, on the one hand, on the user front. And then on the company's front, it's being able to actually operationalize this whole thing. I think in terms of regulations, so there are kind of 2 points I would like to make here. One is that we need to be very careful about how we write regulation, because even when we take GDPR, it's a great regulation, but there are some specifics in it that probably, if we take, for example, cybersecurity clauses, are not quite beneficial for the industry. There is a clause about fines, for example, right? That there is a 4% overall turnover fine if you don't report kind of cybersecurity incident or privacy incident. And as a ransomware gang, what are you going to require from, or what are you going to ask from a company if you attack them? Well, of course, you're going to ask them 4%, right, of annual turnover. So this is kind of giving the kind of extra information to adversaries. So you need to be very, very careful what kind of you put in these documents. And second thing, I am a great believer in not only kind of, having the regulatory approach, which I think is coming up definitely. And I hope that we will, develop something really usable. There is also a different approach from kind of bottom up. For example, there are ideas around bottom up trusts where users are going to nominate organizations that will hold kind of the digital keys from their digital lives. So for example, it could be a consumer organization, or it could be, for example, a bank, right? Banks already have quite a lot of information about us. They know our transaction histories, so they know a lot of information. And so the idea of bottom-up trust is that there is not enough kind of understanding from the user perspective about their rights, and they nominate an organization that will act on their behalf. Right. So instead of sort of giving all the decision making to these large companies, large technological companies that sometimes exploit, people in different countries, as a sort of free labor for collecting, harvesting data, you would have an organization that negotiates. And then this is kind of beneficial to both in the industry and the users, because industry would have entities to deal with, right? So they would have pockets of high quality data, and the users also benefit because they have a representative company or a representative entity that helps them participate in this multi-sided market for data. So I think there is also this opportunity, and I think it's very practical. It's probably one of the most practical possibilities that I heard. There are, of course, other quite fantastic scenarios like declaration of digital human rights or something like this. I think we are very far away from that. I think that's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, it's interesting, when I think about the regulation, like, for example, like, I really like the fact that we have the explainable AI, and doesn't, part of GDPR, and it doesn't say what explainable AI, but it gets very specific about the level of rigor of like the detail of the explanation, the quality of the conversation, the fact that two humans have to explain the model, right? The person that is acting on that behalf of the model and the person that is, receiving that feedback, and it has to be humanly understandable. And I think these are really great, right? Because they establish, something that goes beyond a data scientist, definition to one that becomes very practical. At the same time, right, I think when we look at some of the regulations, sometimes it's not specific enough, right? And I think this kind of focus on specifics, I think even in the EU regulation, right, people look at it and they're inferring, right, and it'll take some time for, the specifics of how it gets implemented and how it gets complied with to sort itself out. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I do think the other thing that you brought up, which I also think about quite often, is just the disparity in who can participate in the regulation or meet the regulation, right? So we have a lot of small fintechs and others that, they may not have entire sort of teams that we're going to focus on how to respond to regulation. So, I think this concept that you brought up of, maybe others being brokers of helping with that or establishing standards is going to be super important. Or it may just sort of create a continued sort of disparity against, smaller companies that just won't have the horsepower, I guess, right, to interpret and to respond to the regulation, because it will become a large sort of portion of their, total energy they can expend. And that's another sort of challenge, right? The regulations are great, right? But not all companies will be in the same position. I know that's of interest to you also, right? Because these fintechs and innovators are really important to challenge the way that we look at AI and what the possibilities are with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we already see this in SMEs, right? So SMEs are quite active in digital space and data-driven space, and they're really struggling because there is such kind of vast amount of documents and regulations, but also risks. They need the skill sets, and they don't have the capacity to develop correct sort of rules of the game, even internally. So yeah, it's a big problem for SMEs.
Exactly. No. Well, I mean, with that's a good segue to what might be one of our last questions here is, if regulation is inevitable, right? And you're sitting there and you're a data scientist today, or you're on a board and you're looking at your company. What are the steps that maybe you could recommend, and maybe I'll have a few that companies can take today, right, to anticipate regulation, to basically get their their businesses in order and in shape, so that they can respond and be ready for a defensible standard against to respond to ethical AI concerns and regulations. So what's your thoughts about those sort of tangible steps that companies can start on today to try to be prepared when they start to see more of this regulation?
Yeah, I think this is a very important problem, and there is no easy answer. I think that, well, first thing that you need to realize as a company, well, of course, I don't know the right answer, but I'm just going to tell you what I do in these situations. So yeah, the first thing that you need to realize is just trying to do the right thing is not enough anymore. It's just not enough anymore. And what you need to be asking when you're developing a piece of technology is, can it harm anybody? And this is a big question that will lead you probably to a lot of interesting thinking about whether you should develop your technology or not. So this is how I approach the technology that I develop. Sometimes it could be totally benign goal. For example, we wanted to create an app for food banks, and then it turned out that it could create dependencies, so people would actually kind of exploit this app in their own way, and so on and so forth. So you need to think about, can this technology harm anybody? That's the first question. And the second thing, I think, is because it's such a complex area, what usually helps me is talking to someone outside of my field. If you think about technology development, the whole operational process is completely broken. Even though data penetrates throughout the entire supply chain, we normally have developers sitting in one department, right? Like in the UK, we have this film IT crowd, where people kind of sit in the basement and they don't talk to anyone else. And then you have actually people who are domain experts, and they rarely actually communicate. So it is important to communicate, but it's also important to communicate outside of the technology field. So for example, if you are a technological company developing AI, do talk to some ethicists, do talk to people in arts, because they would give you a completely different perspective on the problem. And this will help you to actually identify potential risks with the technology that you are developing.
No, that's great. I love the call out to the IT crowd. It's one of my favorite programs. I think it's important. The collaboration across silos within an organization that generally wouldn't have a conversation today is really important, right? So we talk about a board level sort of conversation around the risks. I think relationships with your legal team and establishing these, looking at regulation together. And then one that I'm really focused on are established standards, right? Like writing it down for an organization. Some of the colleagues that I talk to in the field, they get very, very concerned that there's too much pressure on a data scientist, right? It's hard enough to build a great model and a good model. It's even harder to build a fair model or ethical model. And then you can't have that be the spin of the wheel based on who the data scientist is within your organization. And so standards of, what does it mean to be ethical and build a model properly? And what are the steps we're going to go through and be able to audit that, right? This sort of concept of auditable AI, I think is really important, because at least if you write it down, right, and you start this journey, you can always evolve it and make it better over time. But without that, right, it's like what you mentioned, it's this sort of mottos of do no harm, right? Or but that it only goes so far, right? Having a sort of playbook that we use that talks about proper sort of product development or software development or AI development, I think really, really is important. So that's one of my constant sort of recommendations for organizations. And I think that will be part of the framework that leaders like yourselves at the Allen Turing Institute can help with, right, to establish standards of what would be great steps, and maybe those will be the frameworks that will pave the way for a more ethical AI sort of framework in the future. Ghana, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you today. I think we'll end on that note of standards and communication and broadening the conversation within companies. It's always very insightful to talk about these topics with leaders such as yourself. For those listening in, the next LinkedIn Live will be on August 31st. We'll be with Jordan Levine, and we'll be talking about, is AI biased, and really talk about AI and where we're going to look for bias and how to evaluate bias, which is definitely important here as we talk about ethics and the use of AI. So Ghana, thank you once again. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Scott. And I think this next conversation is extremely important, because if I don't know if you heard, just a few days ago, there is a great, interesting precedent in Australia. Australian court just ruled that AI could be an inventor. So AI can actually be recognized as a patent owner. And the bias topic is extremely interesting in that regard. So thanks a lot. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Okay, see you next time.
See you.